Good afternoon and welcome to the second episode of the Oxford Smart Space series. Today, we're going to look at how space technologies could help us support complex supply chains and the role of small and medium-sized enterprises on those supply chains and how they're impacted by them. And in turn, how space and new space can help us achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And to do that, we have an absolutely amazing panel of speakers. But before that, I want to remind all of you that you're part of this discussion and you can ask questions and pose problems to us and the panel, and we'll have a chance to respond at the end of the discussion. And we really look forward to your questions. And also, please make comments in our comment section. So now I'd like to introduce you to our panel, who are absolutely amazing. We have, before I do everything, I'd like them to introduce themselves. So we have Anu, we have Vanessa, and we have Sam. And I've done that in completely the wrong order because I'm such a Luddite. So initially, Anu, let's start with Anu. Please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself for those who don't know you already.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Anu Ojar. I've got a number of roles in the space sector. I'm one of the directors of the UK's National Space Centre. I'm a member of STFC Council now. STFC, which is not Swindon Town Football Club, it is the UK's research council that funds an awful lot of our high energy particle physics and astronomy research, and we've got 2,000 scientists and engineers, a lot of them based down at Harwell. I'm a senior science advisor to the Director of Human Spaceflight and Robotic Exploration for the European Space Agency. And then I've also got a professorship at the University of Leicester in the School of Physics and Astronomy. Lifelong lover of all things space focused, and really delighted to be here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Anu. And I think most people will know Anu. And we have a brilliant entrepreneur, Vanessa Clark. Vanessa, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Oh, well, thank you for the kind introduction. So I'm Vanessa. I'm co-founder of a Series A startup. We're based in Denver, Colorado in the US. Our mission as a company at Atomo Space is to allow any orbit to be accessible. So we really want to open up space environment for more operators to bring more benefit to Earth. But we're not a launch company. Our goal is to allow mobility in space by operating what we call orbital transfer vehicles, or space tugs. In addition to that, and the company, I'm a Carmen Fellow, and the project that I'm working on is to help realize sustainability in the space supply chain. And I'm sure I'll get to talk about that later, but sustainability and supply chain resilience is something that I'm really passionate about, and I'm looking forward to talking about that today.
Thank you, Vanessa. And Sam, who sits at the very heart of innovation in the UK. Tell us more about what you do, Sam.
Thanks, Anna. I'm Sam Adden. I'm Chief Strategy Officer at the Satellite Applications Catapult. So we're a technology and innovation centre focused on driving economic growth through the use of space and satellite data, and very much looking forward to the conversation this afternoon.
Fantastic, Sam. And I suppose I'd better introduce myself. You can see my name, Arnab Dutt. I'm chair of the Social Value Policy Unit at the Federation of Small Businesses, which is why I'm so evangelical about the power of small business. And I sit on the Cabinet Office SME panel, again, looking at how we can set up mission economies and how government can influence complex supply chains to bring about innovation and disruption and onboard SMEs, amongst other things. So let's ask some questions of our amazing panel. How are SMEs getting involved in space technology? And where is our innovation coming from? Are companies like Tesla, Amazon, and the space agencies doing enough to fertilize our space? And is enough being done to actually engage SMEs and startups with space? And what more can we do to ensure we have a pipeline of innovation? And Anu, I'm going to start with you.
Well, thanks, Arnab. I'll take a step back, actually, because whenever we're talking about space and SMEs, we often use this phrase new space. that I think many of you will have heard of. And you ask 100 different people, you get 100 different definitions of new space. So to me, a new space company is characterized by being very fleet of foot. Very often, they're prepared to accept that they're much more innovative in terms of their thinking. Very often they've got much younger people coming through. I mean, young people or younger researchers, young entrepreneurs are the real crucibles of creativity. It's not senior academics like myself. And so a new space company to me has got individuals who are really driven, who are pushing the boundaries in terms of innovative capabilities. Very often, because of the size of these companies, as we know, for any of us involved with SMEs, you have to multitask and have multi-roles. And so, when I look at the power of new space, it is harnessing the innovative ideas and drive that a traditionally perhaps younger workforce will have, not exclusively, pushing through in new areas. Because as a sector, we've been doing space stuff for more than 60 years, since 1957, and understandably, from an engineering perspective, we tend to be very, very conservative, sometimes over conservative. And so to me, the new space companies are also willing to push traditional boundaries of received engineering wisdom, but also they're pushing against, and this is one of the challenges, a 20th century governmental bureaucratic system when it comes down to, for example, funding routes, etc., which poses some challenges. And I'm delighted that Sam's involved here, because I think the Satellite Applications Catapult is an initiative that is trying to really push and reduce those barriers in those areas. So for me, the innovation is coming from youth, from drive, ambition. And one thing you find with all new space companies, and I think generally people work in the space sector, is a real love, I'm not going to use the word passion, a real love of the perspectives we get from space, the capabilities we can have using platforms in space, and the opportunities there are if we're going to get data sets from space for the benefit of all of us, not just a small subset of society.
That's fantastic. I love that, harnessing the drive of young innovators. And that just flows beautifully over to Sam.
It certainly does. I mean, innovators are hugely important to everything. And I think one point that's really important to emphasize is that space it touches so many different sectors. It touches so many different people, and that's, in terms of SMEs, it's a really broad landscape that they can engage across. So over the last decade, we've seen startups and new businesses, fantastic innovations across lots of data-driven businesses using the data and connectivity from space across small satellites. And now we're moving towards a very rapidly opening in-orbit economy. So in terms of what's happened so far, we've been seeing massive, great new businesses across Earth observation, particularly into the finance sector, across connectivity, innovating across transport. You name all sorts of sectors that are benefiting. And I'm sure over the course of the next little while, we'll talk a little about the in-orbit economy that's developing, but it's developing very quickly. And actually, what used to be a sector with very high barriers to entry, certainly high financial barriers, they're coming down very, very rapidly. Interested that you touched on Tesla and Amazon, given that those two companies are arguably run by the two people that had the most effect and impact on the sector over the last decade, and certainly over the decades to come. I think it's quite. I don't know the businesses perhaps well enough to comment on their positions with respect to SMEs. I mean, Tesla, if it's like the rest of Musk's businesses, he's probably quite vertically integrated, but he's certainly bringing in space technology with some of the sort of smart antennas and things that are linked to his Starlink constellation. I think Amazon do need credit to be given. If you certainly look at everything Amazon Web Services does, they're fantastically supportive of SMEs and driving growth and innovation, certainly in geospatial services. So I'm really very positive on where we are in terms of the pipeline. Lots and lots of work's been done to stimulate ideas, stimulate interest, and you look at what's been done by the space agencies. Well, there's networks of incubators, accelerators. The UK is really strong, but across Europe, across the US, actually the pipeline's in a good position. There's a great startup financing ecosystem. I think the statistic that came out this quarter is that there's been $250 billion of early stage investment into space related businesses now. So I'm really positive. And to answer your question on where the innovation's coming from, it's come from everywhere. Innovation requires need to meet the art of the possible, and just the rate of change of need in the world. We're going to talk about Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, that just describes perfectly a range of massive needs. And then from a technological perspective, the rate of change is just vast across robotics, AI, all sorts of healthcare innovations. Innovation is everywhere, and space is really benefiting.
Sam, it's really exciting to hear just the breadth of where these technologies are touching across, right across every sector. That is exciting news, and I can hear the excitement in your voice about how we're accelerating through. And this is why Vanessa's voice is really important, because as an entrepreneur who's faced all the challenges of bringing a new business into this sector, you have a very, very particular viewpoint, and I'm really keen to hear how do you see it. And Anu and Sam, is that the same picture that you see, or is it slightly different from where you are?
So I agree with everything that was said previously. I think one of the important points that we touched on before is like, why are new space companies or space SMEs so innovative? And how I think about it is incentives. So if you look at a lot of the larger aerospace companies that really have built their businesses on serving government missions, their highest priority is achieving mission success. Their risk profile is completely different to a company that enters the market looking to address a commercial or non-government customer base. And so companies like ours that are primarily commercial are just able to have a different risk profile, innovate more, take bigger risks with missions and technologies, and even business models. I think that the definition of new space also gets kind of blurred. If you look at kind of the first commercially focused space companies, it actually goes back a really long way. It's not just the current era of new space startups. I mean, if you look at SES, if you look at Iridium, like these were really the trailblazers for commercial space services. And these systems are still providing commercial services, but more players are able to enter the market because, as Sam said, a lot of the barriers to entry are lowering. So not just things like launch cost, which is the obvious one, which has dropped manyfold in the past 20 years, but also a lot of the ancillary technologies and then the supply chain base and costs as well. So being able to leverage systems from the automotive industry, from personal computing industry, and then all the way through the applications that have actually made real businesses possible, such as being able to add AI processing to large data sets. That really, this perfect storm of influencing factors, both upstream and downstream, has really jump-started this new age of space entrepreneurship. Second part of your question was, what are larger companies such as Amazon and SpaceX doing to really support SMEs? Also an interesting point that Sam made, and that yes, these companies do tend to really be vertically integrated. But one thing that we've seen with SpaceX, and that SpaceX does really intentionally, is attempt to foster ecosystems, even if it's not within their own supply chain. So one great example is SpaceX's decision to start transporter missions with their Falcon 9 rocket. So rather than selling their rockets to a single primary payload, and that primary payload would then have to find secondary payloads if there was additional mass and volume on the rocket, SpaceX has started carving up their rockets. So it's really a true rideshare program, and someone can buy a 10th or a 20th of a rocket pretty easily. And that's actually how we're launching our first systems. But because of this shift in business approach by SpaceX, all of these businesses have sprung up that leverage transporter missions, service transporter missions, service transporter customers. And that was actually really exciting. And that's only happened in the past 2 or 3 years since these missions have started. And so that is one of the key things that larger companies can do to help foster SMEs, even if they're not in the supply chain. Like realize that everything that you do as a large enterprise can have these flow-on effects. So making sure that you align incentives so that you have good partners, good players like SpaceX did with transport is really important. The last part of your question was about space agencies and what they're really doing to incentivize SMEs. So historically here in the US, there has been a really large space industrial base. So here in Colorado, there are over 400 aerospace companies. Most of those are small businesses. And that's mostly because of the way contracting mechanisms work for US government contracts. A certain percentage does have to go to a small business, so for 500 employees or less. And so around each large aerospace company that's able to execute a large program, and again, a local ecosystem forms to meet all of their needs, and so that that large contractor can be in compliance with some of these contracts. How that's evolved recently with more VC investment and with more commercial opportunities, the government here in the US has been trying to incentivize companies like ours to be able to bid on government programs. And one of the best changes that they've made recently was actually on the Department of Defense side. So rather than going out with a solicitation that said, hey, we need this really specific gadget or material or technology, they completely changed how they wrote requirements for solicitations and said, like, here's our problem, or here's our capability gap. We want a commercial solution to fill it. And so that small shift changed the SME base from focusing on R&D and specific technologies and materials to actually looking at how can I take my commercial capability and modify it to serve the government need, which is how we've gotten our government contracts, because we started focusing on commercial, and now we're realizing that we don't have to build something from the ground up from the government. They're happy to work with a modified system. And so they're getting a lot more responses to solicitations and a much more diverse and small business-based supply chain just because of that simple change.
Wow. I mean, that's a fabulous example of best practice mission economy. And making a small change that has a profound impact, on the SME ecosystem. I'm going to bring that back to Sam, and maybe Sam can bring that into probably the next question that almost leads into, because this is about SMEs and innovation. I think Vanessa's last point has really led beautifully into my next question, and because Sam, you're really at the heart of nurturing innovation in the UK with SMEs. Onto these complex technology supply chains for space. So what part can space technology play in making our complex supply chains more resilient and transparent?
Thanks, Arnav. It's a good question, and actually space is really well suited. You get typically global objective data that allows massive transparency from space. I mean, it's worth emphasizing that space is, in nearly all cases, just part of the solution, but it's usually an incredibly important part. So I've got perhaps three areas I'll touch on. The first one is very relevant given Oxford, actually. So one of the initiatives that's run out of Oxford is called the Centre for Greening Finance and Investment. And one of the things that they focus on very much is asset level data. So what asset level data involves is precisely that at the asset level, say at a steelworks level, you've got the asset, information about the asset, the location and the ownership. And you can overlay things like carbon emissions or pollution or that kind of thing. And space data is critical because it not only can it help you identify assets that you using AI that you might not have picked up or known were there, but then you can obviously overlay the emissions and other layers of information on top of it. So that allows everyone from the asset owner, the asset manager, actually the person on the street, to see where impacts are being, detrimental impacts are coming from, and hence to do something about it. It's all about climate action. And the second one then pushes down to climate action in supply chains. So actually, again, in part due to satellite data, it's now possible for us, the consumer, buying from our supermarket shelves, to understand what the deforestation impacts of the coffee we're buying are, or the illegal fishing impacts of the fish we're buying, because you can use satellite data both Earth observation to understand some of the at source impacts, and then positioning and connectivity data through the supply chain, things like smart barcodes and that are RFID tags to follow in the coffee case from bean to bar, all of these impacts, which is starting to have a huge effect. And just generally, because of the data and information, you can see efficiencies, understanding where things are in supply chains, where there are blockages, because you can see often in real time where goods has got to, how it's traversing ports. There's some great businesses, for example, that can show you all the liquid natural gas supplies throughout the world, where they are, where the ships are, where the blockages are, where the where the supplies are full, where they're not. It's incredible just how this data is unleashing all sorts of innovation. Space data plus AI is really starting to change the way we can manage our planet for the 21st century.
Guys, so that's really, really exciting. And so I've got a question on the back of that for Anu, but also it almost goes back to what Vanessa was talking about towards the end when she was speaking. And because Anu, you're really at the heart, of looking at the bigger picture. You work with governments, with space agencies, with multilateral organizations. So my question to you, I know it's a bloody awful question, but what will it take to create a global mission economy where we view innovation through the prism of space technology to address net zero and the UNSDGs?
Yeah, as a question, I suppose the way I would put it is just to follow on from the point that Sam made. Prince William asked a really valid question recently with all the climate challenges and environmental challenges we face. Why are we doing space? Well, by having our armada of satellites monitoring the Earth in near real time at multiple wavelengths, we've effectively, it's like having a patient in an ICU. Without the instrumentation that you need to monitor that patient at multiple levels and with really high levels of data refresh, whatever interventions you're thinking of doing, you're stymied from the start. So effectively, that orbital architecture we've got monitoring our planet has been crucial to meet, to get the information so that we can meet the challenges for the future. That's why when you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, so there are 17 of them, they are a sort of North Star of how we are seeing development in the 21st century globally. And 9 or 10 of them can only be addressed at scale and at pace by using those data sets that we're getting from space in real and near real time. Now, you mentioned my work internationally. So I've done a lot of work with obviously with the European Space Agency, UK Space Agency, but at the moment I'm doing some work with the South African National Space Agency. What we're seeing in developing countries, the desire to have a space program is not national profiling. I mean, well, there's always an element of that, but it's being driven by the fact that space capabilities are no longer a nice to have. They're a must have if you are to address the fundamental challenges that you face if you are running a region, you are running a city, you are running a country, where you're thinking about the environment, where you're thinking about health, where you think about population issues. And so what we need to do, though, so we all know this within the space sector. The challenge is, I think in the space sector, we're very good at talking to ourselves. We've got to communicate that message outward to policymakers, to the general public, to new businesses in a much more effective way. That's the reason. Our failure is the reason why Prince William was asking that question. Yes, he was channeling David Attenborough to a certain level, but we need to do a much better job of communicating just how critical our space capabilities are going to be to meet those challenges of the future, which are being highlighted now in a very different way to the way they were 30 years ago. When we look at the focus on the SDGs, when we look at the focus on, net zero, environmental impact, driven probably by public pressure, these are now, this is a new parameter space that many sort of senior policymakers may struggle with reactively rather than proactively. The way the 21st century citizens are seeing the world is very different to the way we are. And in order to safeguard the future, for population, for climate, for the environment, for our opportunities, those space data sets are absolutely crucial. I'll stop there. I'm hoping somewhere in there I've answered your question, Arne, but it's turning into a stream of consciousness, so I'll stop there.
No, that's absolutely superb. And I loved your metaphor about the Earth being a patient in an ICU with our space technologies being the monitors. I just thought that's brilliant. I'm going to use that if I can steal it off you.
So I also have some thoughts to add to what
I wanted to ask. I want to ask the rest of you too. Vanessa, please go ahead.
So in terms of like policy, let's assume that Anu is correct, and we have managed to convince the stakeholders and decision makers the importance of space-based data collection. And
we're halfway there.
Yeah.
We're not there yet.
In terms of actual policies that are going to be really meaningful, I think that there are two approaches. One approach the US started to enact. So one thing that happened recently that was pretty exciting. So the current administration issued an executive order that requires reporting of emissions, just reporting of emissions. And so not really any repercussions or enforcement or restrictions yet, but just asking companies to report what, how they're impacting the climate. And for a lot of the companies who are going to be subject to these reporting requirements, they currently don't have any way to track that, particularly oil and gas companies, or even logistics companies who are operating systems cross-country or internationally. And space-based data and Earth observation is really going to be the only way to do that. Reporting obviously is the first step before you go to enforcement. So we need really the space industrial base to mature enough to provide the data to these companies so that they can meet their reporting requirements. So I think it's a phenomenal step in the first step in the right direction. And obviously once all of this is in place and is more mature, then we can start enforcing it. Obviously that's happening at a national level. It needs to be international. So I think that if it proves to be really successful here in the US, it's something that could be adopted internationally. The other approach that we need to look at from a policy perspective is, okay, the best economic policy that is also aligned with environmental goals needs to incentivize good behavior rather than penalizing bad behavior. And so looking at mechanisms that incentivize good behavior, such as carbon trading, is a scheme that I'm really a fan of. Things that all, really incentivize people to reduce emissions to make more profit rather than fining people for emissions, I think is the best approach. So that type of incentive-based policy in combination with slow rolling these reporting requirements that is going to build up our space-based capability, I think is what needs to happen at a policy level, not just nationally though in the US. This type of thing has to have international collaboration.
No, thank you, Vanessa. And I completely agree with you about carrots instead of sticks. And carbon offsetting. But again, with that, there's been gaming of the system. So we have to be cognizant that occurs and have systems to make sure that we don't have that gaming that has occurred. And in terms of the UK, I've been involved with something which was called a PPN 0621 that is now on the books, and that is the mandatory reporting of your net zero and where you're going. So that's already occurring in the UK. There's a lot of stuff that's happening, and it does. And this is what about I talk about looking at best practice globally and adopting it, and it's really exciting to hear that's going on in America, but it's also happening here. I want to.
Can I come in on the mission stuff, Anna?
Oh, please go ahead. This is yours.
No, I think we're not far off actually. If you look at things that are really galvanizing purpose globally, then clearly it's not universal, but it's probably two things that really have galvanized global activity and global purpose are net zero and the UNSDGs for very good reason. And if you look at actual sort of innovation policies and technology policies across the world, it's amazing the number that have those two plus space actually either top 3 or certainly top 5. The level of international interest in space is growing incredibly quickly, and actually, I think it's for very good reason, because really, as we look forward, more and more of the major challenges that humanity faces are going to come, well, have a solution, or at least part of the solution, from space. It's obvious if you think about it. Any closed system doesn't end well, So actually, it really does make sense. And I think Anu touched on the fact that space really needs to do a PR job, and it's been very, very hard over the years. What does going off to Mars have to do with the person on the street? Not so much. Actually, today, through some of the technologies we're seeing already, we've talked about sort of global objective data from Earth observation, managing the planet. We've got connectivity that's helping us transform everything from the way we work to our transport systems. But actually, just around the corner, space-based solar power for new energy, new materials for net zero managed from space. Bit further off, but you've got resources from space. So all of a sudden, these 3 missions that you've identified actually come together incredibly powerfully. I very much see that it's the sustainable development of Earth that will drive the economic development of space. And not just that, we need to drive the economic development of space in order to give ourselves the best set of options for the brightest possible sustainable future on Earth.
And almost leading on from that, and I address this to both Vanessa, and to all of you really. But as you've just spoken, Sam, I'm going to throw this one at Vanessa and then come back to Anu. So what sort of data and information can space technologies collect that will help with governmental policy improvement and calibration around net zero and the UNSDGs? I know this is quite a big one. What would you like to see, and what do you think is possible here? So I'll start with Vanessa.
Yeah, so we've already mentioned asset tracking. We've already mentioned Earth observation supporting emissions tracking. So a couple additional ones that I find really exciting and maybe aren't as obvious. So one really interesting application is in terms of agricultural optimization. So waste in our food supply chain is obviously a big issue, particularly when it comes to water preservation. There are a whole bunch of researchers, but now also a couple of startups looking at providing services to first privately owned agricultural companies such as primary producers, but then also people in the agricultural supply chain looking to provide data such as soil health and monitoring, soil moisture content, so that everyone can really optimize how much they irrigate. So these companies, Regrow is an example of one that's based here in the US, started in Australia, that is really doing a great job in terms of agricultural optimization. So allowing less water to be used to get more produce, I think, is also really important in terms of sustainable development goals. There's currently really no incentives aligned with their business coming from the policy side of things here in the US. Water rights is definitely a hot topic here in the US that needs to evolve to meet the changing global conditions and the sustainable development goals. And so I really think that there needs to be more policy support incentivizing using things such as the data sets and insights provided by companies like Regrow. Another less obvious example that I also want to mention is coming back to asset tracking, looking at some of the largest greenhouse gas emitting industries. So automotive is obviously one. And I think the advent of GPS and having navigation systems in cars has actually contributed more than we think to reducing greenhouse emissions. If you cut 5 kilometers off a trip, we have a UK audience, 5 miles off a trip, and times that by 1 billion car trips a day, how much are we saving in terms of greenhouse emissions? Same in the aviation industry. So until just over a decade ago, in certain latitudes, commercial aircraft weren't tracked, even though there was a geostationary Earth orbit-based asset tracking system. This obviously happened to Malaysian Airlines flight. Recently, we have low Earth orbit-based asset tracking systems that allow these aircraft to be tracked all the time, which means we can move from the old operating model, which is when these aircraft flew into these blackout zones. They would have to have very conservative flight paths that stayed miles away from other aircraft in the vicinity until they again had their location being tracked, or when they were again within coverage of ground control systems. Being able to track these aircraft for their entire flight path has allowed us to reduce their flight path distance, and then also be able to reduce the subsequent fuel consumption, resulting in billions of dollars of cost savings, but also reducing millions of tons of greenhouse emissions. So again, like looking at some of these small optimizations and incentivizing them in logistics and other emissions, really high emissions industries is one thing that I think we should do from a policy perspective.
Can I follow up on that? Because I absolutely agree. And one of the things that you mentioned earlier, Vanessa, is absolutely right. Going from monitoring to enforcement, and what we're trying to do, and I think space is going to provide the only data at the refresh rate that is possible to monitor, to enforce, but then we could somehow, and I need to be careful because I've got a conflict of interest here because I'm involved with a company that is doing just this. How can we look at using that monitoring data to incentivize companies to change their behavior? And there are ways of doing that. But I want to come at it differently as well, because when it comes down to the environment net zero, for me, as big a challenge for the future is feeding in an equitable way, not at a subsistence level, that growing world population. So, 3.5 billion when I was born in 68, 7.7 billion today. Probably, we're past that peak growth, but still going to be comfortably or uncomfortably towards 9 billion by 2045, 2050. And we know geopolitically that water security, food security is a major driver of conflict. Now, this is why we're seeing, and we're certainly seeing it in the United Kingdom, with a really coherent defence space strategy that is allied to, in our new space landscape in the UK, our new civil space strategy. We're seeing the United States with the it's not just a rebranding, it's a change in the establishment of Space Force. What we are actually seeing is that the space capabilities are absolutely crucial to help address some of the forcing functions that governments are having to deal with, that are driving political instability, that are driving conflict, etc. So one side of the coin is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The other side of the coin is if you have any type of governance framework, be it nationally or internationally, the key factor you need is intelligence at data volume and at refresh rate. And that's where space is so critical as well.
Yeah, just to pick up on some of the points you made, and I think actually it's fascinating the sort of policy and how that can, how much you do or don't need then to be able to enforce stuff. You clearly need some level of it, but in many cases, just gentle nudges can have a big effect. If we take the example of illegal fishing, just the fact that people knew that there was data now that could show that bad things were being done, just nudges the risk-reward balance, and it's actually had a massive effect. So I think, as you say, this data can be underpins ever such a lot, be used in a wide range of ways.
Yeah, just one last thing that I just want to add before I promise I'll shut up is one example. Recently globally, and we are in an unprecedented global geopolitical situation at the moment. The release of imagery by Maxar, showing the disconnect between one narrative and another narrative, had reverberations around the world, politically, in terms of populations, in terms of responses, etc. Once again, and we've seen this a few years ago in relation to areas of Xinjiang province as well. So again, that satellite data, and I keep making this point, at that refresh rate, which is where new space and having new architectures in space come in. This is where I think we're starting to see much more awareness, but we need to build on that, communicating those capabilities to the general public and to policymakers. And I put the two together because the messages that resonate with your skeptical, as we say in the UK, person down the pub, are exactly the same messages that resonate with the most senior level policymakers who might have 10 minutes within their brief to be able to digest those messages and to be able to understand the urgency of
the power and importance of the satellite connectivity has been exemplified as well, hasn't it, in Ukraine? Absolutely critical.
Yeah.
I think there is one really powerful example that I like to use, and that's climate change wasn't widely believed until it was validated by space-based data.
Yeah.
Even though the original scientists were taking measurements from 200 plus sites throughout the world, until we got the data from a lot of NASA and NOAA's climate programs, no one, the scientific community, the public community, the policymaking community didn't really believe it. So that is how critical space is to helping reduce climate change impacts.
Sorry, Arnab, but we can't hear you. I apologize.
No. Well, I know Anna was really keen to also talk about space governance and get your thoughts on that, Vanessa, I think.
So this is one of the topics that I really love. So current state of the space industry is that our enforcement mechanisms for who operates where in space and how are pretty poor. So the main enforcement mechanism for good behavior in space is, surprisingly, through the ITU and here in the US, the FCC. So how the satellites communicate with the ground. It's really the only enforcement mechanism, because once you put an asset in space, really the only thing that happens on the ground is command and control from a ground station. And so ground station is based on the ground, therefore it can be regulated and monitored by a local authority. The FCC in the US is not really equipped with the growth in the space industry. They're the only body that's really tasked with looking at a space debris impact and collision likelihood and end-of-life disposal plan. And it's not really their purview to keep the space environment sustainable. They have to protect spectrum, not the space environment. They care to some extent about space debris, but it's not really meant to be their core competency. So one thing that we're really trying to do here in the US is find a new body who is responsible for essentially space traffic management. Based on FCC filings here in the US, we're obviously seen OneWeb and Starlink launching hundreds and Starlink thousands of satellites. There's filings for 40, 50, 60, I think if you include Kepler's filing, it's like 90,000 more satellites in the next 5 years. The active on-orbit population is, 6,000 satellites? So this is a huge change. And so the governance mechanisms that we have in place here in the US and internationally through the ITU just are insufficient. In terms of sustainable use of space, NASA and ESA do have guidelines, but they're not possible to enforce. They're really just guidelines. And they're also not really conservative enough. So for example, NASA is gently suggesting that satellites should be able to either move to a sustainable graveyard orbit or deorbit at the end of its active life with a probability of success of 95%. If you just look at SpaceX's constellation, if they abide by that rule, they're essentially leaving up tens of dead satellites annually. And that's complying with this requirement. So I think it does need to be tightened, and we do need to find an enforcement mechanism. But going back to what I said before, I'm all about positive incentives and incentivizing positive behavior. One proposed change to the rules is something that we really supported, but I think it was before its time, and that's a surety bond. So requiring satellite operators to have a surety bond on their satellites, and if they cannot dispose of it in a sustainable way, they have to pay up. So I think that this is a great mechanism because it also breeds an ecosystem. So third-party systems, orbital transfer vehicles or satellite servicing vehicles that have to be able to remove debris. And there is a financial incentive there from the former satellite operator, because let's pay 20% of the surety bond penalty and give that to a provider who can remove the debris. So there is suddenly an economic incentive. But I think it's a little bit before its time, since we haven't really proven that out as from a technology perspective yet. But that's one of the things I think we need to do from a policy perspective to make space use more sustainable. The other part, I think, is self-governance. And this is what I really care about and what I'm trying to do with our company and with our community. There has been a lot of focus on space debris, but also before we even launch a satellite to space, there are some impacts to the climate. If we look at emissions from our supply chain, from our industrial base, so wasteful logistics, for example, or even from our manufacturing methods, such as 3D printing, and our test methods, so testing rocket engines on the ground, it's very difficult to pinpoint what really is impacting the climate the most and what should we improve. And so one thing that I'm working on with a small group is, what are smart recommendations that we can make to space companies such as ourselves, such as our vendors, such as our customers, and such as our partners, that also improve the situation. And then the second part of that, once we have established these guidelines, we're looking as to how we can self-govern. And so we're developing really a contractual clause that we will enforce on our vendors and supply chain, and also our customers, asking them to follow these best practices. And this clause is really a grassroots movement, because one of the only things that we can do as a company that can enact influence is to obligate our own vendors to act the way we want them to. And so that's the mechanism that we're doing. I think self-governance is incredibly important, and we have to build a community around it. But first things first, we have to establish the guidelines, which is definitely an ongoing R&D effort.
Oh, that's fantastic, Vanessa. We're going to go to some questions in a second, but I've got one quick one for Onu, and I know that this is really important to you. I mean, because we're all evangelists for space, but are we setting the bar too high? Is the ambition for new space a little bit too overblown? And so, Onu, with your insight over many years, I'd really love your opinion on that.
Well, yeah, and I'm probably giving away my age here because I've seen a lot of this stuff when I was younger as well, in terms of what can be achieved and then what doesn't meet expectations. And I know technologies have changed that make some solutions viable now that weren't there. For me, there are three cautious things I would say when I look at some of the sort of space can solve everything. Sam put it really well when he said space is part of the solution, because there are some evangelists for whom space solutions just should trump everything. But I have three challenges that really concern me. One is, for example, the market for. There are a lot of speculations about the explosive growth in demand for EO and data. Now, that needs to be coupled to the right AI systems, as Sam points out, to otherwise you just get swamped with data. How do you translate it into a commercial product at the end? And so is that commercial market going to be manifest at the scale that people are speculating about? There's a lot of speculations that I think if you put them in front of the board of a company, you know, they would say, look, you've got too many unknowns here. So one is the market. The second area where I think there's some wild extrapolations are on launch costs. Now, at the moment, the lowest launch costs that I'm aware of are Falcon to low Earth orbit, about $2,000 per kilogram. Now, we're seeing speculations once Starship is flying about that dropping down to $200 per kilogram. Now, that's possible. Starship's mega booster hasn't flown yet. You know, we've seen the flights of the upper stage. And all I'm saying is that we need to be very careful sometimes. I have seen people almost building cases based around it is a fact that launch costs are going to drop by a further factor of 10 or 50 in the next decade. No, it's not a fact. It hasn't been established yet. There has been a trend previously. And so I just urge some caution there. One of the things I am really concerned about, which a NASA report from 2014 and the more recent New Zealand Space Agency report says we need more data on, is launch cadence. So if we're reducing the cost of access into space, last year I think there were 135 successful launches out of 145. Now, if we go up to the thousands of launches, or it's not so many, maybe there'll be hundreds of launches with much bigger payloads. What we know is that the lower part of Earth's atmosphere, the troposphere, is sort of decoupled from the stratosphere. And what I mean by that is that once you get particulate injections in the stratosphere, a minute after liftoff, 2 minutes after liftoff of a rocket, that material can stay up there for decades. And we don't have enough knowledge yet on the impact of an increase, a massive increase in particulate and other emission injections into the stratosphere. Now, if you're using liquid fuel rockets, it does improve the situation. So, solid fuel rockets are the real beasts of the issue. But even with liquid fuel rockets, there are a lot of unknowns. And what we don't want to be in a situation is to have to react to something having done potential damage. So I'm not saying these as showstoppers. I'm saying that we just need to have some consideration from lessons learned in the past. For example, the space debris issue, which was modeled with the Kessler syndrome 20 years ago. A lot of people, myself, even 10 years ago, we're not going to get that model of traffic in low Earth orbit that we need to worry about it. Well, we're looking at what's happening with mega constellations, not just Starlink. We are going to have concerns about that. And in a similar way, we had no idea when I was a child in the 1970s that all those CFCs we were using in our aerosols and in our refrigeration systems were leaking into the stratosphere and ripping apart triatomic oxygen, ozone. So I'm saying in some ways, let's do the right environmental impact and financial modeling. And if needs be, if I go back to that market issue, perhaps the market is there and we just need to communicate it better. So those are just my cautions. I'm not as Spiro Agnew used to say, a nabob of negativity on all of this. I'm just saying we need to be quite measured and perhaps do a lot more research before. I do worry that the wild speculations you have, they can end up being hyping up a curve, and then you can get complete disillusionment. And we need to make sure we've got our technical, our scientific, and our market data correct.
That's a really sobering message and a really important one for all of us who are very evangelical and committed to this mission around new space. And we have a great audience out there, and we've got some lovely questions. And I want to bring you guys in the audience into this. So there's a really good question from Phil Curtis from First 30. Can we in the UK learn from the American private sector on innovation and incubator models, and how do we stop young specialists spinning out of this sector and taking their valuable commercial experience with them? Great question. Let's start with Anu.
Do I actually looked at Vanessa, at your background, and I think you did just this, but not necessarily. Well, I think you did it in the US, but the point
is,
I
worked in Germany for 5 years and moved to the US to start Atomos.
So I see that's absolutely right. This is also happening in China. So China in 2017 issued something called Document 60, which basically was unlocking their new space sector. And obviously with the work I've been doing with China as part of a UK government framework, I've seen the explosive growth of their new space sector. And once again, it was young people bursting out of the monolithic state enterprises like the China Academy of Space Technology or the China Academy of Launch Vehicle Technology, creating these new space companies like iSpace that have launched a payload into orbit with a Chinese new space launcher. So in the UK, I think we are doing it. I know of individuals who've bust out of the traditional UK big primes, with Airbus Defence and Space or Thales Alenia Space, and even SSTL, which has now grown up from its SME roots. Do we need more of this? I think so. It'd be interesting to see what the primes' perspectives are in the UK. But yeah, and I think this is where the work that the Catapult has been doing is key. I also think the work that my research council, STFC, has done in growing the Oxford Space Cluster from being nothing to more than 100 companies and more than 1,000 people there. Yes, I want to see more of it. Now, some of those people didn't sort of cut their teeth in the big primes, but some of them did. And, you know, Phil, in answer to your question, I think it is happening, but I'd like to see it happen at scale more. And if people think I'm prime bashing there, I'm not, because then it will be up to the primes to maybe look at what is so attractive about these SME companies. And many primes can have a lot of inertia within their company. And maybe, you know, as soon as you get a company beyond a certain threshold, you know, the risk register, through creativity can be held back a little bit. So maybe those primes, as part of the process, will have a look at their own internal structures and organizations and therefore improve themselves as well.
That's a great message. I want to get one more question in, but I know Sam and Vanessa, very quickly, I'd like to hear your views on that question, because they're very germane to both of you, aren't they?
Yeah, so I have two quick thoughts. So one, it reflects what Anu said about what the primes can do. So what SpaceX does very well is enforce a mentality where every individual contributor has to have full ownership of what they do. So they're setting up their employees to be entrepreneurs. I mean, they're entrepreneurs in SpaceX, but they're a prime to leave. That's one thing that's been missing in other primes that I've worked at in the US as well as internationally. The second thing that I think is really important to highlight is the venture capital ecosystem here in the US. I know that there are great venture capitalists in the UK, but anything that we can do to incentivize early stage, high risk investments in local companies is going to be incredibly beneficial.
Yes.
You know, looking at the US and a typical size of a seed round, it is double that of what you could get in Europe. And for hardware or you know, capital intensive companies like space companies, I think helping venture capitalism as an industry is vital.
Sam, can we do better? Can we
can, yeah. I mean, just very quickly, I think it's a sign of a functioning ecosystem. It's a virtuous circle. Anu's touched on it really. Actually, some of the people that have left SSTL are going to go on and they founded businesses that will probably be bigger, and it just, you know, keeps going and keeps going. So hopefully we're on the foothills, and it's going to get better and better.
I mean, I've just got one very quick question, and you're going to have to really, it's going to be very yes or no. We've got a YouTube viewer who said, how can crypto help with cross-border incentives as well as public data integrity and veracity?
So I'll answer this from a perspective. So I am a cryptocurrency skeptic, but I really believe in the ability of blockchain to really help business operations. Just looking at our legal overhead and all of the documentation that we need to go out and do business with that partner or with investors, it's really burdensome. And that is one application of the blockchain. If it could remove a document-based backbone of corporations and make it a blockchain-based backbone, that is one thing that I really believe will help future operations for companies, not just small companies, but large enterprises as well. But the crypto part of the question, I'll defer.
Okay, great. Sam, Anu, very quickly, anything to add to that?
It's outside my expertise base. So
that's made it easy. That's made it easy.
Sorry to pass that on to you, Sam, but I'm not going to speculate about something I know very little about.
Yeah, no, I think Vanessa's hit the nail on the head. I mean, anything that you know, enables smart contracts is fantastic and going to, you know, have a big effect.
All right, superb. Look, unfortunately, we're running down the clock, and there are some brilliant questions out there, and I have more questions for our fantastic panelists, but unfortunately, time has beaten us today. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed today's number 2 of our Oxford series. I want to thank everyone on our panel today, because that was superb, and I ask you all to stay in, tune in, keep engaged, because this is the future, and there is so much more that we are going to talk about, that we have to do. So thank you all for joining us today, and thanks for the great team that backed us up, and my apologies for disappearing. Again, that could have been a satellite blink. I'm not sure what happened. there.
You needed a satellite on it. That's that's the answer.
Absolutely, you absolutely hit it on the head. So I would say thank you to everyone today, and enjoy your weekend.